Okay, well, welcome everybody to an eventful Solar Noon Tuesday. We just lost power here with guys cutting through power lines and everything, but we got back up just in time, only running 1 minute late. So hopefully everybody's got recovered from the Labor Day weekend, and we'll jump right in. Those of you who are new to this format, because we do, of course, record these and put them on YouTube, but we also have folks who are online here live as well. So, what we'll do is we'll recap the latest news from the solar industry, things that have been happening in the last week or so. Then also I'll highlight some of the upcoming webinars, the events that are coming on. And then we try and go into a topic of interest, at least to me, and hopefully it'll be of interest to you. And we'll discuss that a bit. And hopefully we'll get a lively little conversation going with the folks who are online because I'm tired of hearing myself speak. So, all right. So anyway, welcome, and let's jump into the news here. I'm Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com, and this is what's happening in the week of August 31st, first week of September. So global investment in renewable energy projects hit an all-time record this year worldwide, but fell in the U.S. according to a study by Bloomberg NEF. The first half of 2025 saw a reallocation, in quotes, of investment dollars away from the United States, with spending falling $20.5 billion, or 36% from the second half of 2024. It was the steepest drop of any renewable energy investment of any nation. Bloomberg stated the falloff was a direct response to the U.S. presidential election and anticipated anti-renewable energy federal policies, which have proven to be justified. Cancellation of clean tech manufacturing plans outpaced new investment announcements in the second quarter of this year. Developers canceled roughly $5 billion worth of previously announced manufacturing investment in the second quarter, while they only announced $4 billion in new projects. That $4 billion announcement is a 59% drop from the first quarter of 2025 and a 44% decline from the second quarter of 2024. In addition to the removal of renewable energy tax incentives by the Trump administration, tariffs have also had a big impact on these projects. A study by Arvon, which is a leading utility-scale solar developer, found that the cost of solar and battery storage projects increased by as much as 30% due to tariffs on steel and aluminum. EIA projects utility-scale storage capacity will grow from 29 gigawatts in 2025 to 65.7 gigawatts by the end of 2026, just next year, with Texas leading the way with an 18 gigawatt of new storage development planned in that state. Grid storage capacity has seen tremendous gains in recent years, and generators added 10.4 gigawatts of new battery storage in 2024. That was an increase in capacity of about 66%. Storage deployment is anticipated to continue to see growth over the coming decade because really, while wind and solar incentives were targeted in the recent budget reconciliation bill, incentives for storage were left largely untouched. So battery storage projects will continue to have tax credits available to them through 2033. However, they'll still face some pretty stiff headwinds, primarily in complying with the foreign entities of concern restrictions. Now, these limit tax credits to anyone buying components from China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. China accounted for about 74% of the world's battery pack and component exports in 2023. Okay, so they controlled nearly 85% of the world's battery cell production during that same year. The global game of solar panel whack-a-mole continues. All three commissioners at the U.S. International Trade Commission, or the ITC, voted to investigate solar cells and panels imported from India, Indonesia, and Laos for unfair trade practices. The Alliance for American Solar Manufacturers and Trade requested the anti dumping countervailing duty investigation in mid July. The group represents American solar manufacturers who claim that those nations are unfairly competing with American manufacturers. The U.S. market saw a dramatic uptick in solar imports from those three countries once tariffs were placed on panels coming from Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. The U.S. manufacturers claim that to avoid those tariffs from those four nations, global solar manufacturers relocated their operations to India, Indonesia, and Laos, and those country governments subsidized that process. And the restrictions were placed on panels from Cambodia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand after Chinese manufacturers relocated their production from China to those four nations because of tariffs imposed on panels from China. So these things are bouncing around the world and probably will continue. Noria Energy, a developer of floating solar panel systems, has begun construction of the Aria Solar, which is a 50 kilowatt floating solar pilot project in Golden, Colorado, that'll provide renewable energy to local water utilities operations. The Golden project is the first in the United States to deploy floating solar tracking technology on water. My understanding of this is the entire array will turn in the water using little propellers or whatever to track with the sun during the day. Today's conventional floating solar systems are static. They do not track with the sun. This installation will track by rotating the array, increasing energy output by as much as 10 to 20%, according to Noria Energy. The project is located in the Fairmont Reservoir, a water storage reservoir owned and operated by Consolidated Mutual Water Company, which sounds like a fake name if I ever heard one. The 50 kilowatt project is scheduled to begin generating power in September of this year. And that is the news from the solar industry. Does anybody have any additional information that crossed their desk based on? Give you guys just a second to chime in if you wish. Okie doke. All right, so let's look at some of the announcements here for what's going on in the world of solar on September 2nd, which is today.
Hey, Jay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was trying to find the mute button. A quick question.
Sure.
Do you know if the big beautiful bill affected storage, residential storage?
I think all residential incentives are going away as
Okay.
of the end of this year. I believe, yeah, I don't think they made a differentiation. They're really just trying to protect large industry. They're
Okay.
happy. Al,
All right.
do you
Thank
have something
thank
to
you.
add there?
Yeah, I just had a question on the floating voltaics. Is tracking the sun, whether it's on land or a roof or on water, cost effective? A 15% increase in output, is that worth the additional cost to install and operate tracking systems?
Well, it depends on whether you're buying them or whether you're selling them. So if you're selling them, you're going to say yes. It's definitely cost effective. For a residential system, my personal prejudice on this is one of the advantages of solar is that there's very little maintenance. And when you start putting a tracking system on something, you're going to have maintenance and it's going to fail and you got to keep it up. So if it adds 10% to the cost of your system and adds 15% to the production, the sales guy is going to say, look at this, you're getting a benefit. But if you're having to go out there and mess with it, maybe not. Now with the utility scale, they tend to go ahead with the tracking because they have crews. They have crews who are out there working on these things all the time. So the maintenance of it is not such a big deal. Plus, I guess they can then, I think the major reason, if I were designing one, is if it's a tracking system, you can put it vertical in the case of a storm or a hailstorm or whatever and protect your investment. So there's probably a lot of good reasons for the utilities to go with the tracking system, but at the residential level, I just don't see it being worthwhile.
So a related question then is the installation of heating devices to the panels so that they clear off faster in the winter. I've been told that really eats up a lot more electricity than the gain.
I would think so. I mean, of course, if you think about a typical solar panel is only going to be what, 25%, let's be generous, efficient. If any of it is exposed, 75% of it's going to be heat. It's going to clear itself pretty quickly. If it doesn't, then you're probably in a cloudy situation and you're not going to be generating much power anyway.
Good point.
So I don't see any need for adding a heat element to your panels. That just seems unnecessary. Doug, you had a question?
Just a couple comments, anecdotes. This is going back to a previous meeting when we were discussing perovskites. And I had a conversation the other day with a friend, my former colleague, Dave Wilt. I don't know if you know Dave. He's very much in the nitty-gritties of, he's been in PVs for most of his career. He's now retired, but he works with the University of New Mexico and also with NREL. And I asked him if he was kind of one of my go-to guys for details on PVs. I asked him if any insights on the perovskites. I was specifically asking about Oxford since they're shipping. He couldn't address Oxford explicitly. He said he wasn't sure if they were in the test, but they just completed a test of various perovskite panels. That's a direct quote at NREL. And all of them had what are called T80 times of 2 years or less. That is, they underwent 20% degradation within 2 years or less. So not very encouraging.
Not great. Not great. Huh? So, well, it's a new technology. I'm still very bullish on perovskite, and I suspect we'll see a long period of time with the tandem cells where you've got a layer of perovskite on top of silicon, and they'll work through, because as you say, they do tend to degrade in sunlight and moisture, which of course outdoors you're never going to encounter sunlight and moisture, so I guess that would be a problem. But it's new.
So that's from NREL, so that's just kind of where the state of the art is right now.
Yeah. Okay.
So for what it's worth. Also, there was a news blurb I saw this morning. I guess they're looking to restart the Palisades nuclear reactor in Michigan, and I caught the economics. It's right now it's looking like $1.8 billion investment to fire it back up, and it'll produce 800 megawatts. So reference point there.
Yeah, that's well, let's see. You could build a new solar array for cheaper than that, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're going to certainly talk about nuclear because that's the discussion topic here. I wanted to just say, with all the hype on nuclear. Pete, you had your hand is raised there?
Yeah, I just want to point out that the utilities tend to prefer single axis tracking because the time of day of production means something to them, whereas to the homeowner or to the off-gridder, it doesn't mean anything, but to the utilities, it means a lot, for their late afternoon air conditioning loads. So that's why they like tracking.
Yeah, I would think that. And of course, another reason they like the thin film or the cadmium telluride primarily is because it tends to broaden out the production curve, as opposed to having low energy production in the morning, very high energy at noon, and so on. It's more of a flattened curve, so it's better in low light environments. That's probably part of that as well, that they can spread the load better than all of a sudden have power in the middle of the day, which may not be the time you need it most. Okay, any other comments or questions? This is good. We've got a conversation going there. Yeah, if anything pops up, just raise your hand or shout in. That'll be great. I'll go through some of the events here. This evening, the Solar United Neighbors is having a session on decoding your electric bill. These things are getting as hard to read as your phone bill, so consumers do need some help. They're trying to hide a lot of the power increases. September 4th, a discussion about solar connectors. We've had this discussion here in this forum where the connectors, the MC4 connectors, are really the leading cause of fires and shorts within these commercial installations. So it's a big deal. So Then RE Plus is happening in Las Vegas, September 8th through the 11th. If you're so inclined, it's a big event. So feel free. Renewable Energy Plus going on out there. It's a conference, obviously, not a webinar. September 10th, making sense of the one big, beautiful bill. That should take all day, but it's an hour-long session here, so feel free to register in there. September 16th, early design decisions. That's 2 p.m. through Solar Power World. And just to remind everybody, I'm not giving you the links on these. I'm just making you aware of them. You can Google them and they'll pop right up. The amazing way that the internet works. Another conference coming up here is on September 17th through the 19th is the High Performance Home Builder Summit, St. Paul, Minnesota. And this is, I guess, making sense. We're having everybody try and make sense of that bill. I'll give you a hint, save you an hour. It doesn't make sense. All right. We'll just say that. September 23rd, SunGrow Power Controls, 2 p.m. That's very much a product specifics webinar there. The 24th, data-driven trends, just trends on systems. That's another one through Solar Power World. And then our shameless plug for our online and in-person courses that occur. So you can go to solarpvtraining.com and see what we're up to. And that's everything that crossed my desk. Does anybody else have any announcements or any events that you wanted to put out there for the world to know? Give you just a second.
I just Luther here. I just put an event in the chat. It's Solar Thermal Passive Solar Building Research Symposium in the Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, September 7, 8, and 9. I'll be presenting on solar cookers, including hybrids, which will use electricity as a backup, including direct solar PV if necessary. So if anyone's interested, they're going to publish all the videos of the presentations later too.
Okay. Do you know, it seems to me solar thermal a dozen years ago or so was a big deal, getting a lot of hype, but you hear nothing about it. Now, I know you do the solar cooker type stuff, but solar thermal is traditionally hot water when you're talking about a residential environment. And my understanding is that because the cost of solar electric came down so much, the economics just don't pencil, that it's better to get an electric hot water heater and just put in a little more solar electric. Are you hearing any hype about solar thermal being a real viable industry?
Yeah, well, it's still viable in the sense that there's no moving parts, there's no hookups to the grid that can go down, there's no, hail on your solar PV and so forth. It's still a perfectly good way to cook, and there are very powerful thermal cookers that will cook just like woks, very high heat, and so forth. And this group, they're passive solar thermal engineers and architects that are talking about all sorts of ways to do it, and including them in the structures would be kind of a nice little frosting on the cake for a totally solar thermal or a passive solar house. That'll be my theme anyway. Yeah.
Well, I know solar cookers, they definitely, we use them on the farm all the time. Yep. But solar thermal hot water is sort of the big industry that I just wonder. I mean, for those of you who don't know, solar thermal is effectively you're just leaving a hose out in the sunlight and it gets hot. It's a very, very low tech technology. But when you start adding in all the pumps and the various I had the glycol instead of water to avoid freezing of the water systems. A lot of these solar hot water heaters end up being many thousands of dollars, and it just doesn't make economic sense at a residential level. At least that's my impression. Pete, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I took the solar thermal install workshop at our MREA, and the complexity and maintenance requirements are really pretty far out of line for the single family home to have solar thermal for hot water when a few kW of PV added on and you're in business. Yeah, so that's why solar thermal died. Is it just too costly?
too costly, too complicated, and one of the issues I ran into in schools is it was so annoying because they would put the solar thermal program in with the solar electric program. And I would argue the only thing they have in common is the word solar. I mean, one is an electrical trade, one is a plumbing trade. Why are you putting these things together and trying to teach them both? They're two different industries. It's like, we could have solar welding or something, and then all of a sudden welding is in with the solar. So, yeah, okay. Well, you're not telling me anything that my own impression is already there.
I will say that I've had solar thermal array with the evacuated tubes for more than 15 years, and I've had very, very little, if any, maintenance. I did have the controller replaced once. During that time. It may be even longer than 15 years, more like 20. So it just continues to operate on. I don't know why why there's such a stir about maintenance, because I don't really think there is any.
Yeah, we did some experimenting with it at one point. I've got a couple of solar thermal panel units, really from the 1970s. And like I said, it's mostly just heating water in the sunlight. But we decided to see just how quickly it would heat. So we hooked up one of those panels to a 5-gallon igloo with water in it. And we're doing it in just a batch cycling where we use gravity and the thermodynamics of water to heat it up. And I would say within less than 5 minutes, all of a sudden that thing was geysering. I mean, it was shooting steam out of this igloo container, and we were running for the hills thinking, I thought it might take an hour to heat up the water, but it was dramatic. So when it works, it really works. But all right, any other comments before we jump into our discussion? And I'm hoping you guys will all agree with me that nuclear is the greatest thing that's ever been invented, and we'll move forward. I don't want to play my hand here, but I really wanted to go into this thinking, okay, there's a lot of hype in this whole thing about nuclear. We're seeing this a lot, getting all of the data bros getting on board and just kind of looking at it saying, okay, I know I've got my own prejudices about these things. Let's look at it with a fresh set of eyes. I found that was kind of impossible as I stepped into it, but fair enough. I'll show you what, and then hopefully somebody can argue me down. This session is again worth half an hour of continuing education credits for the ETA solar PV certification. If you are there, and you can get a certificate for it on our website, Solar PV Training. So like I said, unless you're hiding under a rock and not really looking at energy news stuff, you'll have heard this new interest in nuclear. And I guess I've been in this industry, in the energy solar teaching, for a while. It feels like this happens every so often. There's a revitalized interest in nuclear until something bad happens, and then everybody runs for cover again. So I'm jaundiced in that regard. But I just pulled this video off of the Department of Energy website. They're really big on nuclear. They're hyping it up. Nuclear powered data centers. You're hearing somebody just mentioned about a nuclear power plant being revived. They're talking about not closing some, and it makes sense. Okay, give them the logic on this. If you're talking about, we have a huge need for power. So just on the surface of it, we have this huge need of power from AI and data centers. And I think we can all, accept that. I've got some numbers here coming up, but there is going to be this huge load demand. The load demand requires 24/7 servicing. So right off the bat, you say big load, 24/7, sounds like a job for nuclear, for sure. I mean, that's what nuclear is good at. You turn it on, you just leave it running. You don't have to fuel it except every, 18 months, every 2 years, you put in new fuel rods or whatever. The amount of power that's generated is concentrated. It's very centralized. It's a centralized energy system, and the load is going to be centralized in this case as well. You locate a data center right there next to a nuclear power plant, and you've got a big load with a big provider of load that's available 24/7. There's deep pockets here. These companies that are developing AI, they got a lot of money to spend. So, okay. Plus they all have rockets that, and then now they want their own nuclear power plants, and they're all thinking they're the next James Bond villain or whatever. And that's just part of their own internal narrative. Look at me, I think somebody didn't hug them when they were young or something, and they're compensating. But anyway, and the power is reliable. It is, unless the thing about nuclear, I always think about the line from there's an old movie Moonstruck, I think, where they're talking about plumbing, but they say it's a good technology unless something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong, right? Anytime you're involved with any technology, something's going to go wrong. Well, in the case of nuclear, when something goes wrong, it goes really wrong. There's that joke about what is a renewable energy spill, a nice day, those kind of things. So if you have a wind turbine that fails, not a huge deal. If you have a solar array that fails, no big deal. You have a nuclear power plant that fails, you've got 3 Mile Island, you've got Fukushima, you've got, Chernobyl. So it is a big deal, and it's a big deal for a very long time. So that, of course, there's an upside, but then there's a downside. But I don't want to dwell too much on the risk. People would say, oh, nuclear, more people have died, from bee stings than nuclear power plants and whatever. They probably got a point, but I still don't want a nuclear power plant built next door. So there's going to be that reaction. So then the conversation inevitably comes around to, oh, you're talking about that old technology, that 3 Mile Island. We're talking about small modular reactors, right? This is the thing. We've got these little reactors that you can bring in, and you can set up one of them next to a data center, or you can set up one next to a village or whatever. And this is the new technology. This is what we're talking about. Don't tell me about Chernobyl. We're talking about this new thing. So what are the advantages of SMR, small modular reactors? Well, first off, they're small, right? Small size, small footprint. You can locate them where you want to locate them. Because they're modular in nature, they can essentially be built in a factory and then shipped to the site. So that's the thing where you say, all right, the time involved in construction and all of that, we can get past that by doing it basically the mobile home of nuclear power plants, right? We're going to build it in a factory, and you're going to follow behind one of them on I-70 and curse all day as these big trucks go past and drive by at 3 miles an hour. So you can locate them next to the load. That's great. That's good, especially for these data centers. Some of these data centers are massive. I think, was it in Alabama or maybe Louisiana? They're building a data center the size of Manhattan, right? I mean, that is a huge, huge data center. And because they can be small and because they can be scaled, they can have a lower initial cost, certainly lower than the many billions of dollars that are required to build a full-size nuclear power plant. It will be less. It will not be less per kilowatt hour generated, but it will be less in total cost. So those are some of the arguments in favor of these small modular reactors. Some of the arguments against is they're expensive. They're very expensive per kilowatt hour of generation. They're also dirty. They produce a lot of radioactive waste, a disproportionate amount compared to a normal nuclear reactor, which is already a bit problematic. These are worse. And they rely on passive cooling systems, like let's submerge them in a pool of water. Well, pool of waters have never been known to leak. So there are passive systems that, based on climate events like we saw with Fukushima, or just malfunctions, right? These passive systems may be difficult to recover in the case of a problem. So yeah, you're going to have a smaller meltdown, but you're still going to have a meltdown. So you've got these kind of potential risks. Those are downside. I think the granddaddy of them all, the disadvantage is they don't exist. Okay, these guys they're talking vaporware here. There are currently two working models in the world, one in China, one in Russia, and we know how reliable the data would be from those guys. So we don't even know if they're really working. They're just two little plants, right? This is all theoretical. So the whole argument hyping up nuclear is based on a technology that I think might work sometime in the future. And I think it might be cheap, and I think it might not kill us all, so let's move forward with it, because why not? Okay, well, the projection is that before we could get this thing to scale, to deal with the issue of data centers, it'll be the 2040s before this particular technology is ready. So 15 years minimum before we even have a prototype that could be done to scale. That's problematic. It seems to me if you've got a solution that doesn't exist, you don't have a solution. So that's a big issue. So now we're back to just regular nuclear, because that is really your only option currently, viably. Okay, I'll take a breath here. Anybody have any comments on what I've said so far, or anything you want to add to the discussion here? Yep, Ralph, you got your hand up there. Just unmute.
I'd love to see the math. When it comes down to it, you got all the people promoting the technology. When you actually sit down and do the math for all the research development, there's got to be a handout there to government for a subsidy. At least in Canada, the companies love to put their hand out and request a subsidy from the government. And I think any solution that we have has to pay for itself on its merits. The other point I wanted to make was, in our situation in Canada, small modular reactors may be a viable solution for the far north, where they're using diesel fuel that has to go in on barges down rivers in the summer to get to these outposts in the north of Canada. And that's where it might become economically feasible, because the alternative is so incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
That's what I have to say.
Well, I suspect the economics have been discussed on many a golf course in Bermuda, at the expense of the nuclear power lobbyists, I have a feeling that's where it pencils out, where it makes sense. I did hear a discussion with Jigger Shaw, who I like. I used to listen to him on some energy podcasts, and he was the I think deputy director of the Department of Energy for their grants programs and things, and he's very pro nuclear. He was hyping it. The one interesting thing, and I've got a slide that'll mention this, he said it has to be, and he said one nuclear power plant doesn't make sense, but 10 do. You have to create an industry. So they're looking at it from the perspective of, let's recreate an industry that has died. I think they're fantasizing a bit, saying, if this works and this works and this works and this works, then sometime in the future we might see it become economically viable because we've created a whole new industry, and this is going to carry us through to the next 400 years or whatever. But I think there's an awful lot of wish casting and all of that. If you've got to have 10 successful things to make one of them work, I wouldn't hold out my hope. I'm still hyping perovskite, and we just heard that that's kind of maybe a fool's errand. So who knows? I just think that's so. So let's look a little bit at the history of nuclear construction, because I think it's informative here. If you look at the nuclear power plants that have been constructed here in the U.S. as of 1990, it kind of stops, right? There are a couple of them in the 90s. Then we end up going to Vogtle, really. This is, and think about that when you're looking at this graph. If you're a nuclear power plant designer, if you're going to school to be a nuclear power plant, to design and build nuclear power plants, if you're tooling up a factory to do this, you're not going to do it, right? From 1990 on, you got no work. There is no industry. There's no capacity to build nuclear power plants. That's why these guys are saying, we need to redevelop this industry. We want to recreate the 70s, 80s, 90s, where we had this industry. Well, that industry doesn't exist. It just does not exist. And there's some real reasons. Of course, it fell off largely after 3 Mile Island. We just stopped building them. So let's look at the ones we did build. Really, the Vogtle, it's hard to say, Vogtle. There were 4 units at Vogtle. This is down in Georgia. Units 1 and 2 became operational in 87 and 89. Okay, that was part of the end of the heyday of nuclear. But they wanted to expand it to units 3 and 4, and those units began commercial operation in 2023 and 2024. So really in the last couple of decades, those 2 power plants are those are the 2 that are added, right? They're not new power plants. They're new reactors added in existing power plants. So it's not a brand new thing. All right. So it's the first one really since 3 Mile Island. In 2008, they submitted the application. 2009, they got federal guarantees, federal loan guarantees, right? Because you can't build these things without government help, because private industry is not stupid, right? They're not going to finance something that has a snowball's chance of actually paying off. And so you get loan guarantees there, and then 2013, they began construction. Now, well, just look at that. I mean, internalize that for a minute. 5 years before construction begins? All right. Well, this is a problem we're dealing with in the next 3 years. So I would say right off the bat, and this is our only history. You can wish cast and say, I want this to happen faster, but our history have not shown that it does happen faster. They said, okay, once construction begins, it's going to take us 3 years to build these 2 things, and it's going to cost us $14 billion. That was the plan in 2013. So what happened? Well, it didn't happen, right? It was delayed 7 years for plant number 3, 9 years for plant number 5. Okay, so instead of taking 3 years, it took 10 years for the first one. Instead of costing, what did I say, 16 billion? Is that right? 14 billion. Billion here, billion there. It's cost 35 billion. So more than double. More than double. So it took 4 times as long, and it took twice as much money, and they're estimating it added 20% to Georgia consumers' electric bills for the next 60 years. So this is problematic. Could you imagine if a solar array did that kind of thing? How much support there would be for solar? I mean, this is crazy. So this is our most recent history. This is the only history we have in the last 30 years. And it's one of tremendous cost overruns, tremendous delays. No reason to expect we're not going to see something similar if this goes. So why is this happening? Why are all these problems? Well, one is there's no industry, right? you're going to build this. I mean, it's basically saying we want to send a man to the moon, but we don't have anybody who knows anything about building rockets. I mean, you have to create an industry here. And it can only be done, as Jigger Shaw said, it's got to be done to scale. You've got to build an industry and then build a power plant. Well, you're not going to do that in the next 3 years. It's just not going to happen. So what is this demand that we're expecting here from data centers? Well, they're expecting that the data center demand is going to increase 4 times, 400% by 2030. Yeah, Doug, you've got a comment or a question?
Yeah, there's a whole nother thing, and I used to deal with this when I was working with the Air Force and Energy, and I just put the information in the link. The other miracle that needs to occur is production of enriched uranium. We have been decreasing the amount of production capability, and that's not trivial. Down in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, it's massive facilities were required to enrich the uranium for reactors, and we don't have the capacity anymore. So currently, according to the link I just supplied, we get about 27% of our uranium from Russia because they make up the demand. So if we're going to scale up, we're going to be buying a lot from Russia, or we're going to have a massive government investment and billions and billions of dollars to increase the production capacity, much less the disposal capacity.
Well, I wonder if the Trump administration is going to enforce those foreign entities of concern issues, since they would be buying product from the nation of Russia, since they're going to enforce it in solar. Yeah, I'm sure they won't be hypocritical about that. So, okay, so the electric demand from AI is just going to be through the roof. Now, some people I've talked to about this, they think this might all be overhyped, overblown, possibly, but it's still going to be pretty dramatic. Pretty massive there. Currently, if we look at the numbers, currently data centers require about 4.4% of all of the electrical demand in the U.S. They're projecting that could be as high as 12% by 2028. If you just look at the amount of energy that's consumed by data centers, 58 terawatt hours in 2014 up to 176 in 2023, looking to increase that to about 580 terawatt hours by 2028. And that last chart there, I think, just showed or projected really by 2030, pushing up towards 1,000 terawatt hours by then. And the data centers, the industry is looking at investing huge amounts of money. They're expected to invest $400 billion in AI here in the US this year alone. Most of that is going to be in the data center world and building these processors. So a lot of investment. I mean, it may be overhyped. It may be curtailed at some point, but it's still going to be pretty massive. I mean, these guys are committed to it. And I always like this slogan. I found this, but anyway, here with energy, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. All right. Well, with energy, don't say, this nuclear would work. But what about the alternatives? We don't compare it to what's ideal. We compare it to what's available, what will work. The bottom line is the data centers need a lot of power and they need it very quickly. I'm wondering, I haven't heard if these guys, it feels to me like they should be worried about this, and I suspect there's smart people out there that are worried about it. They're hyping up the nuclear thing. I just saw where Meta bailed out a South Carolina utility with $100 million to build a big solar array because they want the power. I read another article recently about a big data center going off grid because they couldn't get interconnection permitting fast enough. So I think we're going to see a lot of those, a lot of microgrids and off-grid systems where they simply build their facility, they build their own power plant, and you can bet that power plant is going to be solar. It's not going to be nuclear. It's not going to be nuclear. And why? Well, I mean, we've seen this chart before. This is the levelized cost of electricity. But if you just look, and I think it's informative there, first off, the cost of nuclear, the green line there at the top, is going up, and it goes up each year. Currently, that number is hovering somewhere in the $200 per megawatt hour This is the wholesale cost of generating the power. Compare that to wind and solar, which is down closer to $50. So nuclear, on the face of it, is going to cost 4 times as much as solar, 4 times as much as wind. Well, given the alternatives, why would you pick nuclear? Again, you don't care where your power comes from. You just care that it's there. So the argument against wind and solar is in intermittency primarily. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. But with adding in battery technology, now you've got 24/7 power if you build the system high enough. And let's say it doubles the cost. Now it's $100. Still half the cost of nuclear without all of the externalized issues of everybody protesting at your front gate, possible issues getting your fuel source from Russia, all of these other issues. You're still doing wind and solar. Al, you have a comment?
Yeah, you talked about the data center going off grid, and I've read a lot about that because they either can't get interconnectivity or they don't want to pay the price to the utility, especially during peak demand times. These off-grid systems, where are they getting the panels? They have to be huge.
Yeah, I would think that they're huge. I mean, there are certainly supply chain issues, but yeah, you can get the panels. I guess the question would be, what if they're non-compliance with if they're having to pay import tariffs? What is the? I mean,
well, the vast majority of panels in the world are made in China or some Chinese subsidiary country. I know they've been moving a lot of production to other countries in Southeast Asia, but it's just. And my guess is that even with the tariffs, because China has a glut of panels right now, is what I've read. Yeah. Even with the tariffs, they are more than happy to sell them to you at a competitive price, just to clear their inventory.
Sure. Well, I know I was talking to a fella down in Trinidad and Tobago, and he said he's paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour or a watt, 10 cents a watt for solar panels down there. So, if the average price here is 23, 24 cents, say, yep. You could pay 100% tariff and still come out ahead if you're buying them for 10 cents. So, Doug, do you have insight into that?
Well, a couple comments and I like the Lazard. I've used the Lazard myself many, many times. But the solar power there is, if I recollect correctly, isn't that just straight pulling off? So that's as produced as opposed to solar electricity as stored.
Right. Yeah, that number is without backup, without battery. But
right.
I was just saying, even if it doubles the cost by putting in battery, it's still going to be half the cost of nuclear.
Yeah, the competitor is from my limited understanding, it's mainly natural gas that's going to run the centers because that's 24/7. And the best play there is probably going to be fuel cells, solid oxide fuel cells, like think Bloom Energy type. There's a play there, or turbine. I mean, you can fall back to turbines, which is competitive here. The reasons the SOFC can come in is that they do have a higher installation cost, but because these are running constantly, then the higher efficiency makes up for the capital cost. There's a trade there.
With fuel cells that are their primary hydrogen fuel source is natural gas?
Well, yeah, they just run on natural gas, yeah, with solid oxide fuel cells.
Okay. All right. Yeah. One of the issues that I saw, and I don't know about the fuel cell issue. I mean, my understanding of fuel cells is it's an expensive technology, but the natural gas turbines, the natural gas turbines, there's a real supply chain issue.
Yeah, I think that's actually being addressed, but the solid oxide fuel cells, Bloom Energy has put them out. They're not the only ones, but they run on natural gas, they run on oil, they run on alcohol, they run on hydrogen, et cetera. They do not require hydrogen generation, so you can just plumb them in. They do require some maintenance, just like any such system.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they're kind of on the same price drop curve that PVs and batteries have had. They've been coming down quite a bit. So I think there's probably a good play there because again, these are on 24/7, and the typical turbine is about 30% efficient of gas to electricity, give or take. Bigger turbines a little more, smaller turbines less. And the fuel cells typically are about 50%. So that's where that goes. But there's another factor that's also kind of ignored in the whole AI thing. And again, this is because I think it's a lot of marketing hype, and this is just me opining. But I spent good 20 years of my career doing quantum mechanics, doing numerical simulations. I used to be a big high performance computing user, and what I lived through and saw was where the speed to produce a calculation just dropped by orders of magnitude. And that wasn't just the computer speed itself, it was improvements in algorithms and methodologies. And there is a huge, just speaking economically, there's a huge prize to be won if you can develop a better algorithm or better methodology to run the AI, which will run faster and cheaper. So in other words, some of these power projection demands will probably be a little high, is my suspicion, because as time goes on, they'll get more efficient, and then the demand will go down. Now, they'll also be competing against more people using it. So, it's just a little caution on those slide projections from my perspective.
Yeah, no, fair point. Al, you've got a comment?
Yeah, it seems to me that just like with cars, that the short-term solution for these data centers, the only solution for these data centers in the short term, is going to be some kind of a hybrid power mix. And a good example is not far from where I live here in Northeast Ohio, we have a gas-powered utility scale electric plant. And those would be relatively easy to install, and this is relatively small. Now, I don't know about the supply chain issues that you mentioned, but it seems to me that that would make sense when paired with the other two low cost from your graph here, which is wind and solar. So you do the wind and solar, and then when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, you augment with your hybrid production system, which would be natural gas. It makes the most sense of anything else.
Yeah,
we got plenty of it here.
I think it's you guys are sort of pointing out that for a robust industry, we need to have diversification of fuel sources. And I think that's one of the arguments that the folks in charge who are supportive of nuclear would say, yeah, we want this and those other things. I think their allegiance there is just misplaced. Of all of the different technologies, I just think nuclear is not viable. Natural gas has its place, maybe fuel cells, wind and solar for sure, certainly hydro where it's available. So there's a lot of different, if we tried to rely 100% on solar, that would be problematic as well. So we need a diverse energy source. It feels to me like we're going to see a lot of these data centers go standalone, off grid. I'm already starting to see reaction against them because people are starting to blame them for increases in their electric bills. So just from a PR standpoint, I don't know that even if they went standalone, they probably still get the blame. But, these guys have the money. So we've talked about before when we're faced with power outages because there is not enough supply to meet the demand. I would say that the guy first in line is going to be the data center who's got the deep pockets. So it's going to be the folks who don't have the economic resources who are going to be the ones who are going to have their energy curtailed. So there's going to be a big PR thing. I suspect, like everything else, it's going to be blamed on renewables, but what the heck. Okay, so if we just say, okay, we need this power quickly, we need it in a hurry, what is the options? Well, solar, this just the construction, not talking about permitting and all of that others that could drag on for a period of time, or interconnection. just construction, according to the research I did. Solar about 1 to 2 years. Natural gas, 3 to 6 years. Wind, 3 to 8 years. Coal, 3 to 5 years. Well, no one's building coal power plants. That just doesn't even fall into the discussion anymore. And nuclear, 10 to 12 years. Well, why on earth is nuclear falling into this discussion when at the outset we're talking, let's be generous, 2030? That's 5 years. Well, you're not even going to get started. And there's many a slip twixt cup and lip. Let's say they decide to build up this whole nuclear thing, they get it underway. 10 years from now, we've got a completely different political world. We've got a completely different economic world. And most of those systems are just not going to go to fruition. They just don't. They don't make sense. So why all the hype? Well, I've said this before, but my feeling is they're just chasing money. When we look at some of this money that the government is handing out, $900 million to support the deployment of next generation small modular reactors. Well, shoot, I'll take a bit of that and I'll study it. $6 billion to look at not closing down existing power plants. Well, if you're an energy business and you've got a power plant, sure, I'll take $1 billion not to close it down. What the heck? So I really think a lot of this hype is really the government throwing money, people hyping it so they can get it, so they can all feed at the trough, and it will once again come to nothing. And if there is another nuclear disaster anywhere in the world, whether it's a Fukushima type situation, all this discussion ends. It just ends right away, because that's just the nature of politics and people. As soon as there's another meltdown somewhere, we'll have another 20-year break before this hype starts up again. At least that's my expectation there. So I think that we're right at the end. So I want to thank you guys for your attention, and I'll let you know when the next one's going to be, but stay tuned, and thanks everybody for staying tuned there. All right,
Thanks,
take care.
Thank you.
Take care.